Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We are live today with a very special guest. We have Simon here. You already know Simon, I'm pretty sure about it. He's not only a Java champion, but he's an expert in so many things in the area and a known member of the Java community. Thank you very much, Simon, for joining me today. I can't wait to learn a lot of things about CQRS, Vaadin, and many more from you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we met each other a lot of times, and we discussed many interesting subjects. And at some point, you were telling me about architecture, software architecture, and how you see things now going in different projects that you work as a consultant for. What do you think about the trends in this direction?
Yeah, I'm already working as a software engineer for 30 years next year. And I've seen so many trends going on in the past. And one thing that's very popular currently is the way back to the monolith. So people are starting with monolith. There's an excellent framework by Oliver Dropbaum. It's called Spring Modulith that helps to create modular monoliths. I'm using that for a customer project. Currently, we are doing a prototype, and we also start with kind of a monolith.
Back to the origins, no?
Back to the origins. We have other, like, we have some goals. We want to split the application at the end because it's too big. An ERP system for wholesale market has around like 1,000 database tables or 1,000 entities, speaking of the Java code, and that's not a very good idea to keep it in a single project because they are currently working like 4 teams on this project, and we try to modularize that and to give like or to create more like self-contained systems. I don't know if you heard about that. It's introduced by InnoQ. Stefan Tilko is one of the origins that created it. And there the idea is that you have a stack from the front end back to the database, and you split it like that. So usually you split it by business feature or capabilities or bounded context if you're doing domain-driven design. It doesn't matter how you name it. But the idea is to have like self-contained systems that are independent from each other as possible, or as much as possible. That's the goal.
Is that a good idea with any kind of application, or do you see sometimes a mix of maybe monolith and microservices?
It really depends. So in my opinion, all the architecture styles, monoliths, microservices, self-contained system, whatever, are just a tool in my tool belt. So it's possible that you have like a single application that has 3 styles in the application because there are so many different things. So for example, also serverless with function as a service could be something that you want to introduce because you have a single functionality that could be used from various parts of your application. So you can take it out and publish it somewhere just to use it. Or you say, okay, we have like supporting domains. So for example, in an e-commerce system, you have like a customer management, you have a product management. That's more like a CRUD style application. You could keep that together as a monolith. And then you say, okay, but now my e-commerce systems, like the web shop where the people can buy the products, will be introduced or will be built like a self-contained system. And maybe we will, for example, introduce synchronization of the data to the microservice or the self-contained system, just to have it simpler, for example, or to have it more flexible. It really depends on the requirements. So there are so many requirements coming from the customers or from the development team or from the management. So it really depends on that. So.
Cool. So before going further, I just wanted to remind, we have a lot of people who already joined. Friends, you have a live chat there. So if you want to ask questions, now it's your chance. If you want to start discussions, do use the live chat. I will keep an eye on the live chat, and I will make Simon attentive on your questions. And if you don't join us live, because I know many of you will still see us later, you have the comment section in the video. And by the way, Simon has also a YouTube channel, and you want to join his channel as well. He's also in my list of recommended channels here on the YouTube, and I will also leave you the link separately after our event. Thank you, Simon. Tell me more about CQRS. You mentioned that, and you mentioned it in many of your talks. How do you see that integrating in today's architectures?
If you look at an application from like the UI part, you will notice that you have different types of views or functionality in the UI, for example. So as I mentioned, you will see probably that you have like a user management system. There you have create, read, and update and delete. So that's not something that works very well with CQRS. But maybe you have a view where you more or less just display data. There it very often doesn't make sense just to use the entity model, for example, with JPA Hibernate to fetch the data. You could directly use like a view, for example, in the database, or if you use JPA, if you want to use that, you could use a constructor expression, for example, to directly create immutable objects. And since we have Java records, which are immutable data, this fits very well for the results for the queries that you want to execute. So you will not introduce any side effects if you're not using entities for reading. So querying with as in CQRS is very, very important for getting more performant applications, for example. And on the other hand, if you have like a traditional REST API for your client, for example, if you're using single page applications, then you lose semantics. I mean, you have get, post, put, delete for sure. So you have the HTTP verbs, but very often you want to do or execute the function or a method on the server. So for example, you want to create an order in an order system. You want to add an item. You want to change the number of items that you want to order, for example. And if you think about this functionality, you will notice that those are kind of commands. So you can create the get order command, add item command, and this will add semantics to your application. So we don't have like a single DTO model, for example, a purchase order with items that you send back and forth to the server just to do CRUD. Now you will send commands, and commands will execute the business logic and change the state. There are some misconceptions about CQRS. Many people think with CQRS you will introduce event sourcing, for example. And that's not true, because CQRS was first mentioned by Greg Young and later by Martin Fowler as well. And CQRS has multiple stages. So the simplest form from CQRS is just separating, querying, and commands.
So CQRS is not Kafka?
No, definitely not. So you can, I do that just with a single database. So sometimes you have two databases. For example, e-commerce is a very good example because the commands go to the relational database, for example, but you have like a web shop with a search form where you can search the products. And this maybe is better done with a search engine like Elasticsearch, for example. And then you can use the commands and events, for example, to populate the search engine, or you can simply use a SQL statement to populate the Elasticsearch. So it doesn't really matter. But then you can separate read database and write database. But that's not a must. That's just a second stage. And the third stage will be you create a command, the command gets executed. If it's successful, it will create an event, and this event will then be stored in Kafka, for example, or in another event store. And from there, it can be taken to populate the query database, for example. But that's maybe the third stage of CQRS. But in my applications, I usually use the first stage just to separate querying and commands, especially because I think, as I said, commands should be meaningful, so it's easier to read. The code, and queries should be as fast as possible. And there you have this separation in the application.
Okay, so to see if I correctly got it, so CQRS is just a design method and it doesn't stick me with any technology. I still have a variety of ways in which I can implement CQRS, and it's not necessarily Kafka. It can be a database. It's not a specific kind of database. It can be any database at my choice, which of course should be according to my project and according to my case.
Absolutely. CQRS is, in my opinion, just a design pattern to make the code more readable, more maintainable maybe, and more performant. So that's the goal of CQRS, but it gets mixed up. Also, CQRS is not in any kind related to domain-driven design.
Mm-hmm.
Because
I did hear many times from different people linking these two together. So talking about DDD and then sticking CQRS in the discussion like it was part of DDD. So that's, I understand, not really the case.
Yeah, exactly. I also think that when we talk about DDD, initially domain-driven design was intended to talk more to the customer. So to get better software, to get into the domain model, to make the domain model the central part of your application, and to talk to the customer, like DevOps. It's about communication. But what happened later, that domain-driven design was very or was taken by the software developers, and they created architecture styles out of it. They created patterns and stuff like that or frameworks even. And that's not necessary. You just can use the DDD ID to get better communication, to get the domain model, to use the domain model, and then you can add CQRS if you like to, but it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory to use CQRS with DDD, and it's not mandatory to use DDD with CQRS. So they are both exclusively useful.
Yeah, at the same time, I had the same mixture at some point with DDD and hexagonal architecture. And I've seen it even in specific talks at some point, people mixing them together like they can't exist one without the other.
Yeah.
Strange, because sometimes we do make our lives a little bit more difficult just by mixing things that shouldn't necessarily be stick to one another.
Yeah, that's a very good example, because as you can see in my bookshelf, there is the blue book, Domain-Driven Design, just behind me. There
Oh
on the
yeah,
side.
I see it. I see it. Yeah.
And I'm probably one of the only persons that read the whole book, because I'm teaching at the university and I had to read it because I want to teach it. But there is hexagonal architecture is not mentioned in the book. There is just layered architecture as an architecture style, because hexagonal architecture from Alistair Cockburn probably didn't even exist by the time that Eric Evans wrote the book. And as you said, it's not mandatory. So the idea of hexagonal architecture or clean architecture or onion architecture, which are more or less all the same, is to protect the domain. And this idea of protecting domain is perfectly fine if you really have a very complicated domain with complex algorithm and complex business logic. But many of the applications I'm working with are just database-centric applications. So you have a UI, you have validation rules, you have some business logic somewhere, and then the goal is to store the data in the database and to display the data in another part of the application, or on a report or an invoice or whatever. And for that, hexagonal architecture is probably too complicated. For example, you will never change the database type. So if you're using SQL database, you will stay with that. You will probably even stay with the database product that you have, because it's not about just the database product. You have also people that are maintaining the database administrators, for example, and you can't switch them from one day to the other. So probably this is not even necessary. It makes the application more complex. It really depends on the requirements. So
To change a bit the subject, Simon, you are known also in the community for being an expert with Vaadin. And I'm very interested in Vaadin actually because it's a framework of a kind, I would say, in Java at the moment. I don't even know if it has any competition on what it's doing in the Java ecosystem. And I would like to tell us a little bit more about what you think about Vaadin. When should we use it? How should we use it? Some tips and tricks, maybe.
Yeah. Vaadin is for a Java developer is, in my opinion, the best framework. And I tell you why. Because as a Java developer, you usually don't want to build a website, right? So if you do a website like a public website, or if you want to build an application where you have a form and you can enter form data and just do that, like a contact form or maybe some other types of forms, this is not where you want to use but you do. So usually I, as a Java developer, I'm creating business applications. So business applications means they are usually in-house. So for example, I'm currently working, as I said, for the wholesale company, and all the users there, the in-house users, are using an ERP system. So they manage products, they, for example, order products with their suppliers, for example. They are looking at the orders if there are problems and stuff like that. And for that type, traditionally, we were creating client-server applications back in the days. So we had AWT or Swing, later we had Eclipse RCP, and those were the frameworks that we were using because there you have a component model, right? So you create a window, you add the text field, you add a button, you add the click listeners to the button and do something with in this event listener. And later on, we had other interesting frameworks like Java Server Faces, which was also component-based. The problem with Java Server Faces was mainly because it had server state, and people don't like server state, so they
And
moved to
XML,
some.
no? XML is one. I believe that's even a bigger problem, no?
Yeah, that's also a problem. Yeah, but they moved away to like Spring MVC with time leaf or to something completely different. And later on, we had single page application frameworks, but that's a completely different topic. But
So
now
someone from the audience is asking you, Simon, how is Vaadin compared to Spring Boot?
it's not comparable because it's not the same thing. So Vaadin uses Spring Boot. So if you create a Vaadin application by default, by the way, you can go to start.vaadin.com, and then you have like a kind of a little UI builder where you can create a prototype and then download that or publish it on GitHub directly if you like to. And this by default uses Spring Boot as a runtime because Vaadin as a framework is nothing else than a Vaadin servlet. So like I mentioned JSF, there was also a servlet, and Vaadin is running as a servlet in a servlet container and is delivering the application code. The difference between that and, for example, Timeleaf is delivering a static HTML page. And Vaadin, on the other hand, at runtime is a single page application. So this means, sorry?
Can we consider that Vaadin is somehow replacing the Spring MVC, the dispatcher servlet, or something like that behind the scenes? Or
Yeah, kind of. In fact, Vaadin has a very unique architecture. By the way, I must mention that if people in the audience know Vaadin 7 or 8, they were based in GWT, so Google Web Toolkit with the compiler. So back in the days, you were compiling Java to JavaScript. GW2, by the way, still exists and still works. So I have a friend who is using that a lot. But Vaadin has a different architecture. Vaadin is, as I said, a single page application and is communicating with the server. So that means you're developing your application like you were on the server side. And if something happens, for example, on the client side, the user clicks a button, then just the event is sent to the server. And this event is then applied to the component model on the server and is sending back the diff more or less of the state to the client. And what in flow is the component will then re-render your application. So as I said, at runtime, it's the same as a single page application, but without the need for a REST API. But because of server state, you will have server state, and that's some of the disadvantages, in my opinion, of Vaadin. It's also an advantage because it's fast, but on the other hand, you have server state, and we were talking before we were going live about Kubernetes, for example. And if you have a system or a container orchestrator that is randomly starting and stopping instances of your application, you will lose the server state. So that's probably a problem in that scenario. But as I said, Vaadin is a perfect framework for business applications. And with business applications, you usually don't have millions of users. You just have maybe thousands of users. And that's not a problem, even not for a single instance usually.
So I think that answers partially also the next question from one of our followers, which is how does it compare to a JS framework such as Angular? And I think what they mean is in terms of usage, use cases.
Yeah.
When would you use Vaadin? When would you use React, Angular, Vue, JS, or anything else? The approach of JavaScript framework and backend.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, I would say, single page applications have also a problem because they are slow. So the downloading all the bundle. So if you have not a good internet connection, for example, your application will not work because it first have to download the bundle. And more or less that's also the case with Vaadin. And the other problem that you have with single page applications is search engine optimization is not possible because the sites are not statically generated. So if Google comes, it will probably not find anything to index. And that's the same with Vaadin. So they are very comparable from the advantages or disadvantages because they share the same runtime scenario, but they are very different from the way you are developing your application.
So someone is asking us, could we say that this is some sort of a monolithic application holding backend and front end everything together?
No, I would not call it a monolithic application. I would call it a self-contained system. So we have a slice of the application. We could slice our application in multiple self-contained systems or microservices, but each microservice or so-called self-contained system will have its own UI. So the integration of the parts of the application will be with links. So you will not create a monolithic front end or a micro front end or something like that. If this works, I don't know if this works already because it's still not very common. Usually you create a monolithic front end with in terms have the same problem with, like a monolithic backend. But you integrate with links. So you create slices of your applications or subsystem or parts of your applications with the UI. So, but you build both together. So you will get a single deployment unit, an executable jar in terms of Spring Boot, or you can even create the native image if you like to, but the front end and the back end will be together. And that's a benefit in some cases because you will make sure with that way that backend and front end fits together because it's just a single release and not two that have to have versioning or something like that.
Yeah, we have another question, which, to be honest, I'm not sure if I really understand, but maybe you do. Is it like Next.js, for example? I have never used Next.js, so I don't know, but maybe you know.
Yeah, currently what's happening in the JavaScript space, so I'm not a JavaScript expert, but I have a friend of mine, he's also teaching at the university, he's very seasoned in all single-page application frameworks, and especially Angular and React. And there is this new concept of React components. So that means you write components that may run on the client side or on the server side. So the React framework will do that. And to make that work, you will have to implement your front end and your back end in JavaScript or in TypeScript or whatever, but not in Java. So you will also get a single application, and some parts of the code will run on the server, for example, to access the database. Others will run on the client side. And that's kind of a similar idea that you have with Vaadin. It's simply a very different implementation. So it's not comparable.
Cool. Simon, there is a third subject that we wanted to discuss today, aside from CQRS and Vaadin, and I really don't want to miss that one. It's about Jooq, and again, it's one of the topics that the community know you for. And I want to learn more about Jooq because it's today, in my opinion, wherever I go, I do see people, developers, I mean, defaulting to JPA. At some point today, especially with junior developers or starters, you don't even see like they know there is anything else. Like JPA is something like the only choice you have with your persistence layer in a Spring or in a Java application in general. And we both know this is not the case. We have alternatives. Hibernate is not, and any JPA implementation is not necessarily the best in all the situations. And we do have alternatives for cases where we can use them. So what can you tell us more about these alternatives to JPA, and when should we consider them?
So maybe I start with how Jooq works. Jooq is different from JPA in terms of it has a database first approach. So which means you don't create an entity or something. You're not creating a Java class. You're creating a database table, for example. And once you're done with that, you can use Jooq to generate a meta model. So if you know JPA, you know JPA has criteria API, and JPA also creates a meta model that you can use to create time-safe or compile-safe queries at the end. And Jooq has a similar approach. It uses your database and creates objects or classes from all database objects. So even if it's a database table, a view, a stored procedure, a function, a sequence, whatever, you will get the Java representation of that. And with that, you can use Jooq, and Jooq has a domain-specific language, a DSL, and the DSL is like SQL. So you can say select from, where, order by, limit, count, and so on. So you can use fully SQL, but you use it in Java. So the point is with DSL, it's very hard to write a query that doesn't work in terms of the syntax of SQL. And with the meta model that is generated, you have compile time safety. That means if you change the database model, for example, maybe you rename a table, and then you regenerate the meta model, your code will not compile because the table name is different. So that's the benefit of that. The other benefit is that Jooq is also able to use functions and store procedures. And if you already once had to call a store procedure from Java with JDBC, for example, or even with JPA, then you see this is very difficult at the end. So it's not nice to implement that. With Jooq, calling a store procedure or a method of a store procedure just feels like calling a Java method because you have a class that is a representation of your store procedure. And what Jooq also does, for example, it prevents you from SQL injection. So it will always create a prepared statement. So it will not create dynamic queries, even you create dynamic queries. And creating the dynamic queries with Jooq is very easy because the DSL is fluent. But every intermediate step, for example, if you have the projection where you say, I want to have the name and, for example, the department of my employee, you can use that and reuse that. So you can create multiple statements with the same projection, or you can reuse the where condition, or you can put the where condition together in, for example, in a loop if you get a list of query parameters or something like that from the UI. And so it's very, very useful for that. But the difference to JPA is you will not have relationships. So what you will usually do with JPA, you create an entity and then you create another entity and then you see, oh, they have a one-to-many relationship and you map that. Jooq doesn't do that for you. You have to do that by your own. But Jooq has a superpower. It's called the multi-set value constructor. And that means you can use that for queries that will return a nested structure. Because with JPA, how it's implemented currently, you always get the Cartesian product if you do like a join fetch or something like that, or a one-to-many relationship, and it will load too much data. And then it will process the data and return your entity object. With Jooq, you can do that directly with one statement, for example. So speaking about CQRS, we heard that the query side can be beneficial in terms of performance, and there Jooq, for example, works very well. But what you can do, you can mix JPA and Jooq. You can say, okay, I use Jooq, for example, just for querying, and if I want to write the data, I want to have this rich entity model where I can use the automatic dirty checking, for example, mechanism of Hibernate to save the data. So it's up to you what you want to use. It depends on the use case.
Nice. So before I have some questions, but I will give a chance to the audience first because we have a few questions in the live chat. One is a mix on our last couple of subjects. How is the integration of Vaadin with some Java frameworks like Hibernate or Jooq?
Perfect, because Vaadin is just Java, and you can use whatever you want. Because if you create a Vaadin application, you create something called a view or a route, and there you typically use a service, maybe a directory repository, or something like that. So you can use whatever you want with Jooq, with Vaadin, and it works. So it really doesn't matter. Everything that works with Java can be used with Vaadin.
I remember you told us actually that Vaadin is over Spring Boot, so you normally can create your layered architecture there, no, and then you can have your persistence as either Jooq or Hibernate or whatever you want, no?
Exactly.
That should be.
Yeah,
okay.
And Vaadin also works with Quarkus, by the way. It works also with plain Java E or Jakarta E now, so you can have a plain Tomcat, whatever you like to. So it's up to you.
Cool. So I see questions are flowing here. Thank you very much, friends, for sending us so many questions. Is Jooq free to use?
That's a very good question. Jooq is free as long as your database is free.
Okay.
Which means if you're using the latest version of your Postgres database, for example, then it's free because this is an open source database. But if you use Oracle or SQL Server, which are commercial databases that are very expensive, depending on the edition you're using of these databases, then Jooq is not free. The reason for that is Jooq is open source, but Jooq has a lot of special implementations for these types of databases because SQL is a standard, but SQL is not implemented the same way in every database. So you have differences in some variations of how SQL statements are created, for example, or what functions there are by default and stuff like that. And this is all covered by Jooq. So in terms of that, we were talking about changing the database before. When you use Jooq, you can change the database. Your queries will run. So you have to regenerate probably the meta model, but your queries will stay the same because Jooq has like a compatibility mode, or Jooq tries to emulate sometimes even functionality that exists in one database with another. So, and that's the reason why Jooq is not free, because if you use a commercial database that has special features, you have to pay, but it's not that expensive.
Cool. How flexible is Jooq? Someone asks us. Is it something that others can do, like you can't do with JPA, but you can do with Jooq?
With Jooq, you can do the multiset that I was talking about before. By the way, if you go to YouTube and look up or search for San Martinelli and Jooq, you will find talks where I'm presenting about that topic. So you can watch that. There will also be example code that you can have a look. And this multi-set operator is something that it's not possible. So for example, if you have like a constructor expression in JPA where you have the new operator in the query, you just can return flat structures. So you cannot return nested structures, and that's something that Jooq can. The database cannot do that, but Jooq emulates that using JSON functionality from the database. So that's something that probably JPA is not able to, but I think, or I'm sure, Kevin King and his team is working on something like that.
They should, yeah, I think they do. They always invest time in useful things. The next one is very interesting, actually. So we know JPA implementations, they are complex, and sometimes developers make mistakes because of this complexity. And you just said that you can use Jooq together with JPA, which might probably mean more complexity to the application. So would you recommend such an approach, and in which cases?
That's a very good question. I really don't know if I can recommend that. I just can say that I did that in the past
Okay.
because the customer insisted to use JPA or keep JPA for some of the existing parts. The point is that really JPA, it depends how you use JPA. So that's a bit of the problem, right? If you use Jooq, you just use SQL. So it's the same if you use a SQL statement in a string, or if you use Jooq. Jooq adds type safety, Jooq adds compile time safety that you don't have if you use a string for executing SQL. But that's it. So there's not much complexity. The complexity is in Jooq inside because, as I said, Jooq has to take into account which database the SQL query has to run against and stuff like that. But you don't have like these surprises that you have in Hibernate if you don't know how cascading works, for example, or how lazy loading works. Then you will be surprised by bad performance with Hibernate, for example. So you need to know a lot of that because Hibernate is a so-called leaky abstraction because you have to know SQL even if you use an OR mapping framework like JPA Hibernate. With Jooq, you don't have that. You have just SQL. So you need to know SQL for sure. Otherwise, you cannot use Jooq. But it doesn't add additional complexity. So it just keeps you on the SQL level. And to answer the questions, if you know SQL and know what you can do with SQL, you probably might think about, do I really need JPA anymore? Because I can do everything I like with plain SQL. But you will lose some convenience, as I said, like the automatic dirty checking, cascading on deleting or cascading on saving. The orphan removal capabilities, for example, will not be there. So you lose some parts of the persistence layer where Hibernate has benefits, that's for sure.
Someone says, we use Jooq on Postgres on production, and I still find the queries written through Jooq be tricky to understand. Do you want to comment something on that?
Yeah, that's you have to get used to Jooq or how Jooq looks like. I completely understand what the person asking is asking. And I had the same impression. By the way, when I first saw Jooq many years ago, I thought, no, I don't need that. I mean, I can just put my SQL string. It's even more convenient because you can take the SQL string, put it in DataGrip, for example, if you use that, or in IntelliJ or SQL Developer, or however your SQL tool is called, and you can execute it. With Jooq, you cannot copy the Java code into a SQL tool. So that's, first of all, that's a problem. Or if you get the query from someone, you may have to translate it into Jooq. But I can tell you, the longer you work with Jooq, the more used to you get with it, and then it just feels natural. So it's all a matter
Get
of time.
accustomed with the tool. Yeah, you need to know how to use the tool to use it properly.
Yeah.
I
And I
think that's the case.
always, I mean, if you use Jooq or want to use Jooq, you should go to jooq.org. Lucas Eder is the person behind Jooq or the main committer, and he has a blog. And I read all his blog posts. I learn every time something new because he knows SQL so much more than I do.
Yeah,
And
I love his posts. I also follow him on Twitter, and I recommend your friends to follow him on Twitter as well.
yeah, and you learn a lot. So you just have to get used to it.
Yeah. Still have questions. So what should be the ideal case of using Jooq instead of JP? I think we kind of already answered that. Do you want to add anything more on what you have already said?
No, in my opinion, if you have a data-centric application where the database is a very important piece of your application, then Jooq is a good fit. If you use the database just kind of a store, mainly you work on your entities and persistent is just a side effect kind of, then probably JPA is the better choice.
Then someone says the industry still tends to use stored procedures with stored procedures. Will Jooq be finally eliminate that, and how hard will it be debugging? Not sure if I understand the question, but maybe you got it better.
Yeah, the point is stored procedures are something nice if you know how they work, by the way. And even I usually use Postgres or Oracle database. So for my project, if I can choose, I go for Postgres, but many of my customers have Oracle databases. And I know SQL, PL SQL and also PG SQL from Postgres. And for both of these languages are unit testing frameworks. So for example, I'm also a maintainer of UTPL-SQL. I'm responsible for the Java API and the Maven plugin. And UTPL-SQL is a unit testing framework for PL-SQL. So debugging Postgres stored procedures means you write tests for your PL SQL code. If you don't have one of those tools, you can use Jooq to unit test your PL SQL code. So for example, you can use the generated classes to create unit tests that just tests your PL SQL code. And debugging, at the end, debugging of SQL or PL SQL code, for example, is usually writing some information to the database table. So we have like log database tables where we write some information that we need to debug things. Yeah, but it's not the same as you do in Java. So you have a break. So that means you cannot use the same tools for both languages, and that's probably one of the problems.
Cool. Someone shared an interesting statement. So maybe use Jooq for reading and JPA for writing, which would be CQRS obeyed. This reunites a bit the first and the third subject of our discussion.
That's perfect. I mean, I had like years ago, I had a talk exactly about that. I was proposing Jooq for reading and JPA for writing. And yeah, you have different models, like you have a read model, you have a write model or a query model and a command model. And then it's a perfect fit. Absolutely.
Cool. And the last question, I think, and then we will wrap up because we already are 45 minutes into our discussion. So we are getting close to our end of the window. Someone is asking, can JPA plus JDBC template replace Jooq?
No. But first of all, I wouldn't use JDBC template anymore. By the way, there's JDBC client that's so much better and was introduced in Spring Boot 3. Do you know?
Something, yeah,
2?
like 3 or 4 months ago or something like
Yeah,
that. I think, yeah.
that's better than JDBC template. But however, the problem is if you use JDBC template or also the JDBC client, you always deal with strings. So you write your SQL statements in strings. If your database changes and you don't have tests for all the queries, then probably your query will fail in production. And with Jooq, you have the meta model, so you have compile time safety for your SQL statements, and probably it will not fail. So even if you don't have a test, it will not compile if the database model doesn't fit the query. So that's the benefit of Jooq, and that's something you can't have with JDBC template or JDBC client.
Super. Thank you very much, Simon. So I suggest we close our discussion now. I have learned a lot of useful things. Thank you very much for that. I think that our audience, and they were really in a big number, and we had a lot of questions. So they must have learned a lot of things today. Happy for having you here with us, friends. Thank you very much for joining us. Is there anything else, Simon, that you would like to share with our audience before we close?
No, thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure to be here. Lots of
Thank you
fun
also
with
for
so
your
many
time.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great time. Thank you, everyone. We're waving goodbye and
Bye.
see you. Okay, we are out.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. It was really good. A lot of questions.